Yeah, really chuffed. I was actually more excited when the package arrived with the copies of this than I was when my own book arrived, partly because I was so anxious when my book came that it was going to be full of mistakes that were all my fault, whereas in the edited anthology it's more like someone else's fault. But yeah, I mean, to be among the big names in poetry, you know, Marvell, Byron, Tennyson, George Herbert, who was a favourite of mine when I was a student here, and also then the more recent poets included in the anthology. Jacob Polly is one who was here as a creative writer in residence, and his work has been a massive inspiration to me as I started to write myself. So yeah, to be amongst people who I really respect, both living and dead, is a great honour. And to be one of the few women in the book as well is really nice. Obviously there couldn't be many women for most of the centuries because Trinity didn't have any women. So yeah, that's quite important to me, and it's been really exciting to be involved.
But while you were here, you didn't actually write any poetry.
No, I didn't. I studied English here, but as strange as it sounds, it actually never occurred to me to write my own. I suppose I was so busy kind of absorbing published writing and learning how to criticise it and how to write essays, and you know, I didn't know anyone who was a creative writer at that time, so yeah, thought never crossed my mind. But
when did the thought cross your mind then, and when did that thought become actually, you know, practical reality?
Once I finished my academic studies, I was living in London actually, and I was doing various temping jobs, and I missed having literature in my life, so I was reading a lot, and I started reading contemporary poetry then, and realised that there were voices that were recognisable modern voices in poetry, and that poetry wasn't sort of just the kind of academic exercise that I'd experienced, although very enjoyably as a student. And I signed up for a beginner's poetry writing course, an evening class at City University. And that was my first experience of sort of a workshop scenario where you're given tasks and you have to write to a brief, and people discuss the work that you've created, and that was the real eye-opener for me, and I loved it, and I didn't stop after that. So.
Are you resigned to the fact that as a poet you will probably be impoverished for life, or do you have aspirations? I'm
not resigned to it in the sense that I recognise the need to find other employment alongside writing poetry. So I have a part-time job here in Cambridge, and I do freelance work as well. I think people who think there's money to be made in poetry are a bit naive. There are a few amazing prizes out there, and great poets are winning them, which is wonderful, and that raises the profile of poetry. But generally, I think you just have to accept that you do it because you're interested in language and you're motivated by expressing new ideas, using words creatively, and that's got to be enough. If I win a massive prize, that'd be great.
What about the commercial side of poetry, though? I mean, commissions. Would you be interested in commissions? Can you work under that kind of pressure? You know, you must write this by this deadline.
Yeah, I actually love commissions, and I'd like to have more of them. I had a commission a couple of years ago from the Polar Museum here in Cambridge, and that was wonderful because it was just an excuse to get involved in a whole area of knowledge that I hadn't hitherto experienced. So yeah, I think having a brief is really helpful actually, especially if you're used to working under pressure. Like, you know, once you've been through an English degree here, you're used to sort of being made to write to other people's rules, really. And yeah, as soon as you get some constraints, that's when your mind starts going off and getting really imaginative, I think. So yeah, commissions can be really helpful. And also they introduce a sense of collaboration because, you know, you're not just at home or, you know, scribbling away by yourself. There's a sense that you're looking out to a broader, whether it's inspired by a museum collection or someone else's writing or whatever is the basis of the commission. It gets you looking outwards, and I think that's really valuable for a poet.
And your inspiration is drawn from what? What generally makes you take pen to paper or digits to type keys?
Good question. Often I write about nature, which includes human nature. I think we often forget that, and we think nature is trees and birds, but it's people, and we all go about in the world interacting with the physical environment and each other. And so my poems tend to be about real things in the world. They're often set against backdrops of landscapes, particularly in the local Cambridge and Suffolk area where I've spent most of my life. But usually two things or more than two things come together to make a poem. That's where the energy of the poem comes from. You sort of bring together maybe a setting that doesn't go with a mood, and then see what comes out of putting those things together. So.
You don't look like a poet in terms of how we think that poets should look. You're
like a
young.
dead man.
Yeah. You're young and you've got a leather jacket and you look kind of trendy and indie. Is that good in terms of encouraging young people to think about poetry and that it might be for them, not about dead men?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't like to comment on my own fashion choices, but yeah, it was absolutely vital to me to realise that poetry isn't something that sounds old. I mean, it's amazing if you actually asked my dad to write a poem recently. It's a fun activity. And you know, it came out as though he was alive in the early 19th century. And you think, wow, this is the poetry that most people studied at school was Wordsworth or stuff written before Wordsworth. So we're talking right at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's, oh, this and oh, that. And people don't actually speak like that. And I think as soon as you start reading contemporary poetry written now, you realise it's voices that you hear all around you and snippets of real life weave themselves into the language of poetry, and that's the real substance of it. And I think maybe that's something that we could change about the way we encounter poetry at school. But yeah, I mean, not everyone can be a dead man, so.
But it's all about presentation, isn't it, in terms of school? So you, of course, to have context and perspective and a sense of history, you have to teach kids about Tennyson and Byron and Wordsworth and so on. But surely they also have to be given the opportunity to read new stuff, to say this is living poetry of its time, in its time, and you can do this too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Wordsworth's a funny example because in his time he was so radical. The stuff that he was writing didn't sound like what people thought poetry should sound like, but we don't hear that now because, you know, our context is completely different. There are loads of initiatives that get poets into schools which are great, and the Poet Laureate does a lot of work like that, sort of raising the profile of poetry. But really it just needs to be on tables in bookshops, you know, and poets give readings and you go along to hear them and you like the sound of it, you know, you don't necessarily have to read it on the page, and I think that's all really important to get people realising that poetry isn't a dead art form.